The first thing anyone noticed about Private First Class Hazel Morrow was her hands, not her face, which was plain and forgettable in the way that serious faces often are. Not her build, which was lean and unremarkable beneath the standard issue fatigues. Not her voice, which she used sparingly enough that some soldiers in the platoon went entire weeks without hearing it directly addressed to them. Her hands. They were always doing something. Wiping, turning, checking, running the tip of a cleaning rod through a barrel with the patience of a woman threading a needle in low light, pressing a cloth in slow, deliberate circles against a cartridge case until the brass caught whatever dim light the forward operating base offered. There was no urgency in the movement. There was no performance. There was only the methodical, quiet repetition of a person who had decided, at some point, and for reasons she kept entirely to herself, that this was the work that mattered. Firebase Carver sat at the edge of a floodplain in a region where the wet season arrived without announcement and left without apology. It was a miserable place in the way that all forward bases eventually become miserable, not through any single defining disaster, but through the slow accumulation of discomfort. The sandbags absorbed moisture and smelled of rot. The plywood flooring of the barracks warped and buckled. The air was thick enough in the mornings that breathing felt like a minor physical effort. Hazel had been assigned to 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, 7 weeks before the event that would divide everything in the unit's informal history into before and after. During those 7 weeks, she established a reputation without intending to the kind of reputation that forms around people who refuse to match the social frequency of the group they've been placed in. She woke earlier than required. She performed maintenance on her M4 carbine at times that were technically optional. She kept a notebook, a water-resistant field notebook with a dark green cover in which she recorded things that no one else seemed to think were worth recording. The ambient humidity at various times of day, the clay content of the surrounding soil, estimated from the way boots tracked it into the barracks, the relationship between rainfall duration and the failure rate of the fire team's radio equipment, which had already gone down twice in conditions far milder than what the seasonal forecast promised. Nobody asked about the notebook. The few soldiers who glimpsed it seemed to decide, without discussion, that whatever was in it confirmed their general impression of Hazel Morrow: odd, too careful, almost clinical in her behavior, and therefore slightly suspicious in the way that very careful people sometimes are to those who prefer a more casual relationship with preparation. Sergeant First Class Dale Hutchins ran the platoon with the efficient, low-drama authority of a man who had seen enough genuine chaos to have no interest in manufactured drama. He was fair, experienced, and largely unbothered by Hazel's habits. His assessment of her, delivered to Staff Sergeant Ronnie Perkins during a smoke break behind the motor pool, was brief, solid. Nothing remarkable. Does what she's supposed to. It was meant as a compliment. In the economy of combat evaluations, solid was respectable, but it also contained a subtle dismissal, the implication that doing precisely what was required, nothing more and nothing less, was a form of adequacy rather than a form of excellence. The rest of the fire team had opinions less diplomatic than Hutchins. Corporal Brett Tanaka, who had been in country for 11 months and wore his experience like a man wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for him, was the most vocal. He had a gift for observation and a habit of deploying it cruelly. "Morrow," he said one evening, watching her work by the light of a headlamp clipped to the edge of her bunk, "you know the bullets go in the gun, right? You don't have to polish them first." A few soldiers laughed. She didn't look up. "Seriously. I've been in 2 combat deployments, and I have never not once polished a round before loading it. You know what happened? Nothing. The gun fired. Because that's what guns do." She ran her cloth along the length of a cartridge case, turned it once, and set it in the tray with the others. "You're like a surgeon scrubbing in for a grocery run," Tanaka continued, warming to the audience. "It's a carbine, not a Stradivarius. Maybe she's just really proud of her ammunition," said Private Carson Webb, who was 20 and had the cheerfully undeveloped sense of humor of someone who had not yet understood that the best jokes don't require an audience's approval to function. "I heard she spent 45 minutes cleaning her bolt carrier group last Thursday," said Specialist Marcus Fry. 45 minutes. My grandmother spends less time on her Christmas china." The laughter this time was broader. Hazel set down the cloth, picked up another cartridge, and began again. Her face did not change. She was not unaware of the comments. She processed them the way she processed most incoming information, with attention but without reaction, filing them somewhere private and continuing with the task in front of her. There had been a time, earlier in her life, when this quality had been mistaken for passivity. It was not passivity. It was something closer to a very long view of cause and effect. She had learned, through a process she could not have easily articulated but understood completely in practice, that most situations resolved themselves correctly if you did the right thing consistently and waited. The notebook, for instance, had begun after her first month at a previous assignment where she had watched a crew-served weapon fail during a training exercise because of a maintenance protocol that everyone had agreed was technically optional and therefore technically skippable. The weapon hadn't failed catastrophically. No one had been hurt, but it had failed at the moment when, in a real scenario, its failure would have mattered completely. She had started writing things down that evening. She had kept writing them down ever since. In the corner of the barracks, as far from Tanaka's bunk as the floor plan permitted, Private First Class Alara Briggs watched the exchange with the particular attentiveness of someone who was new enough to still be paying close attention to everything. Briggs had arrived 2 weeks after Hazel. She was 21, from a small town in Oregon, and she was still in the phase of her service where observation felt more valuable than participation. She had not decided yet what kind of soldier she wanted to be, and watching other soldiers closely seemed like the appropriate way to make that determination. She watched Hazel set down the final cartridge, cap the tray, close the notebook, and switch off the headlamp. The barracks went dark. Outside, something moved through the trees at the perimeter's edge, and whatever it was, it moved like water. By the 5th week, the jokes had become ambient part of the platoon's background noise, like the generator that ran at irregular intervals, and the drip of condensation from the corrugated roof panels. "Here comes the armorer," Tanaka would say when Hazel appeared with her cleaning kit. Or, "Morrow, does each bullet get a different cloth, or do you rotate them?" She never answered. This, paradoxically, seemed to make the jokes more persistent. Ridicule without response has a frustrating quality. It cannot confirm itself, cannot become a story with a satisfying arc. The person being mocked simply continues doing the thing they were doing, which means the mockery has no effect, which means the next round of mockery must try slightly harder to land. On the 34th day she had counted, not obsessively, but as a matter of noting when patterns began, Tanaka did something he likely thought of as a harmless bit of theater. While Hazel's back was turned during a briefing, he picked up a cartridge from her cleaning tray, pressed his thumb into the mud caking the bottom of his boot, and returned it to the tray, smeared. She noticed when she returned. She did not look around to see who had done it. She sat down, picked up the cartridge, and began cleaning it again from the beginning. Briggs, who had seen the whole thing from across the room, felt something tighten in her chest that she could not immediately name. It was not quite anger. It was not quite admiration. It was something in between, the uncomfortable recognition that what she was watching was not a small moment. "Why don't you say anything?" Briggs asked her that night, quietly, after the others had settled. Hazel considered the question as if it were a logistics problem. "Saying something takes time," she said finally. "I'd rather use the time." Briggs lay in her bunk for a long while after that, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what that meant. She wasn't sure she understood it fully, but she thought she was beginning to. The following day, Sergeant Hutchins gathered the platoon for what he called a systems check, an informal review of equipment status that he ran roughly every 2 weeks. Most soldiers reported their gear as serviceable. A few mentioned minor issues that were logged and largely ignored. When he reached Hazel, she handed him a single page from her notebook, a condensed summary of current humidity readings, their relationship to the clay composition of the surrounding terrain, and a projected window of high-risk conditions for mechanical weapon failure. Hutchins read it. He read it twice. Then he handed it back without comment and continued down the line. That night, he went to his small corner of the command section and looked at the weather reports. They matched what she had written. He sat with that for a while. He did not issue any new maintenance orders. There was no policy he could point to, no clear chain of authority that made a one-page summary from a junior enlisted soldier into a mandatory action item. But he read it again before he went to sleep, and in the morning, he cleaned his own weapon more carefully than usual. What he did not do, and this omission would stay with him for a long time afterward, was make the same choice for the rest of the platoon. Briggs, for her part, had begun extending her own cleaning routine. Not to Hazel's standard, not yet, but she was spending more time than before, and she was paying closer attention. She asked Hazel, cautiously, if she could observe one evening. "You can do more than observe," Hazel said, and handed her a cleaning rod without further ceremony. They worked in silence. After 20 minutes, Hazel pointed to a small deposit of carbon fouling that Briggs had missed near the gas key. "She didn't say you missed this," she just pointed. Briggs saw it. Briggs cleaned it. That was the entirety of the lesson. Outside, the pressure had been dropping for 3 days. The kind of dropping that people who grew up near weather noticed in their joints and their sleep and the behavior of the insects around them. Hazel had noted it in her book. She had drawn a small line across the bottom of the entry, not an underline, exactly, more like a threshold. Sergeant First Class Hutchins received the updated meteorological brief on a Thursday morning. He read it the way he read most administrative documents, with thoroughness and a certain practiced detachment, the mental habit of a man who had learned to absorb large amounts of information without letting most of it penetrate his decision-making until he had assembled enough context. What it said was significant. The convergence of a late-season front with an unusual low-pressure system had created conditions for precipitation levels that would exceed the seasonal average by a factor of 3 to 4. The specific language was careful and hedged, as meteorological language tends to be, but the underlying message was plain. It was going to rain. It was going to rain in a way that this region had not seen in at least a decade, and it was going to do it within a 72-hour window. He shared the brief at that evening's platoon briefing. The soldiers listened with the mild, experienced attention of people who had sat through many weather briefings and found that the relationship between weather predictions and actual weather was, at best, approximate. "We'll adjust patrol timing if it gets bad," Hutchins said. "Everyone check your gear. We may need to move to the alternate positions in Grid Sector 7 if the primary positions become untenable." After the briefing, Hazel approached him. She had her notebook. "Sergeant," she said. He looked at her. He had come, over the preceding weeks, to associate that word spoken in that tone with information he was not going to want to receive. She showed him the page. She had been correlating, for the past 2 weeks, the specific clay and silt composition of the soil in their operational sector against documented failure rates for the M4 carbine in similar environmental conditions. She had cross-referenced this with the humidity data she had been gathering and the projected precipitation levels from the brief he had just read. She had written her conclusions in the spare, practical language of someone who wanted to communicate clearly rather than impress. At the current projected conditions, using conservative estimates, the failure rate for poorly maintained weapons operating in mud and moisture saturation above the documented threshold would run between 60 and 80%. This was not a dramatic figure. It was a figure derived from documented field reports and technical manuals. She had simply put it next to a weather forecast. "I'd like to request a full platoon weapons maintenance inspection," she said. "Before the rain comes." Hutchins looked at the page. He looked at her. He had a complicated relationship with what she was presenting him, because it was entirely correct, and also because accepting it entirely meant admitting a degree of negligence, not gross negligence, not the kind that courts-martial were made of, but the ordinary, human negligence of a person who had not done quite enough with the information available to him. "I'll pass the word," he said. "I can't make it mandatory without taking it up the chain, but I'll pass the word. That's all I'm asking," she said, and returned to her bunk. He passed the word. He told the squad leaders that a voluntary extended maintenance check was encouraged before the weather window hit. He used the word encouraged because that was the most he felt authorized to say without escalating to his captain, which required a level of certainty about the severity of the situation that he had not quite committed to. The response to his encouragement was underwhelming. Tonica did a perfunctory wipe-down of his rifle and declared it serviceable. Webb and Fry did not alter their maintenance routines at all. Several other soldiers spent additional time on their weapons, but in the generalized, unfocused way of people who have been told to do something optional and are producing a symbolic effort. Hazel spent 4 hours. She broke down every component. She cleaned each one separately and precisely. She checked every spring, every pin, every surface that made contact with anything else. She lubricated exactly what needed lubricating and nothing more, because over-lubrication in mud conditions caused its own category of failures. She loaded her magazines carefully, seating each round with attention, because magazine failures were a common source of malfunction that people rarely attributed to the magazine. And she cleaned the rounds. She cleaned every round. Briggs watched and followed, slowly, learning the sequence by observation and by the occasional quiet correction. Outside, the first clouds were assembling on the horizon with the unhurried confidence of something that did not need to hurry. It began the way very serious weather often begins, not with drama, but with a subtle shift in the quality of the air. The temperature dropped 2 degrees. The insects went quiet. The trees at the perimeter's edge became still in a way that was different from the ordinary stillness of night, a tighter, held quality, like breath before a word. Then the rain came. It did not start gradually. It arrived at its full weight immediately, as though some enormous reservoir had been tipped without warning. The sound of it on the corrugated roofing of the barracks was less like rain than like a sustained mechanical process, a thing being done to the world rather than a weather event happening in it. Within the first hour, the lower sections of the firebase were standing in 2 inches of water. By the second hour, the water was moving, not standing anymore, but flowing along the depressions in the terrain, carrying with it a heavy load of suspended clay that turned everything it touched the color of old brick. Hutchins received the order at 0215. A reconnaissance element had reported movement in Sector 4, a creek bed approach to the southern edge of the firebase that, under dry conditions, would have been easily observable and defensible. Under the current conditions, the creek bed was running fast and providing both cover and concealment. The platoon was to move to blocking positions along the southern berm and hold until the threat could be assessed and either engaged or confirmed as non-hostile. They moved out. The conditions were precise in their awfulness. The berm was a 50-meter walk through terrain that had become, in the space of 3 hours, a different landscape than any of them had trained on. The mud at the lower points was ankle-deep and clinging, not the loose, splashing mud of shallow puddles, but the dense, adhesive mud of saturated clay, the kind that grabbed at boot soles and required a conscious muscular effort to extract with each step. Hazel held her weapon as she always held it, in movement, muzzle down but not dragging, barrel angle controlled, her left hand managing the stock-to-body relationship with the attention of someone who understood that the weapon's condition at the moment of use would be a direct function of how she had treated it during every moment. Before that, she watched, in her peripheral vision, how others were carrying their weapons. She noted what she noted and said nothing. They reached the berm positions at 0244. The rain had not moderated. If anything, it had intensified, the kind of intensification that challenges the initial description of heavy, because heavy begins to seem like insufficient vocabulary. The soldiers went to prone positions at Hutchins' signal, rifles trained toward the creek bed, and they waited. The waiting was its own ordeal. The prone position in mud of this depth and consistency meant lying partially submerged in cold, moving water. The water found every gap in protective equipment. It found the gap between collar and neck and ran down the inside of body armor. It found the gap between glove and cuff. It worked its way under rifle stocks and into trigger guards. Hazel felt it all and noted it and kept her hands positioned around her weapon in the specific way that kept the most critical components in the most protected orientation. It required sustained attention. She gave it sustained attention. Beside her, 6 meters to the left, Tanaka had his weapon across the tops of his forearms, muzzle angled slightly downward toward the mud. It was the natural position for a man focused on the threat in front of him and not on the weapon in his hands. It was also a position in which, under these conditions, the probability of mud ingestion into the action was considerably higher than he understood. She looked at the creek bed. The movement was there, a definite, intentional movement, not an animal or debris. Multiple sources. She breathed. The signal from Hutchins came as a hand movement barely visible through the curtain of rain. The engagement began with sound that did not happen. Tanaka's M4 made a sound when he pulled the trigger. It was a mechanical sound, a click, precisely. The sound of a firing pin striking a primer that did not produce combustion. He cycled the charging handle. He tried again. The same click. To his right, Webb's rifle locked back on what turned out to be a round that had failed to feed properly. The magazine follower, coated with clay slurry that had worked its way in through the gap between magazine body and receiver, had lost the spring tension required to push the next round into position. Fry pulled his trigger and got a partial cycle. The round discharged, but the action failed to fully extract the spent case, leaving the weapon in a configuration that required a malfunction clearance drill that, in current conditions, meant exposing the action to the same environment that had just compromised it. 3 weapons, 3 different failure modes, 3 seconds. The sounds from the creek bed were not sounds that allowed for a long interpretation period. "Clear your weapons," Hutchins said, low and hard. And the phrase was correct, and the training behind it was solid, but clearing a weapon malfunction in prone position in running mud water at 250 inches the rain is a different thing than clearing it on a range in dry conditions, and the difference was presenting itself fully to every man on the line who was experiencing it for the first time. Hazel heard the absence of fire beside her. She assessed. This took perhaps 2 seconds, during which she continued to track the movement in the creek bed with her own muzzle. She identified 2 primary figures moving through the bed. She identified a third figure on the far bank using a drainage culvert as cover. She calculated angle and distance with the efficiency of a person who had practiced the calculation so many times that it had become a property of how she perceived physical space rather than a separate cognitive activity. She fired. The sound of it was startling not because of its volume, which was ordinary, but because it was the only sound in the engagement envelope that corresponded to what a weapon was supposed to produce. It was the sound of a mechanism functioning as designed. It was, in the context of the surrounding mechanical failures, almost informational in its nature. It communicated something to every person on that berm beyond the simple message of a round departing a barrel. It communicated, one weapon is working. The figure in the culvert stopped moving. Her second shot went to the left bank, where movement had intensified to the point of certainty. Her third shot was a controlled transition to the near bank, where the primary figure had changed position in response to the first two shots. She did not hurry. She fired with the rhythm she had practiced in every condition she had been able to arrange for practice, which was not the adrenaline-driven pace of panic fire but the deliberate, breath-governed tempo of someone who understood that accuracy was a force multiplier in a way that volume of fire was not, and that a weapon with 30 rounds that could not be replenished was not a weapon to treat as though it had unlimited ammunition. She did not waste a round. 4 rounds. 4 shots placed with the intent and outcome that the situation required. The movement in the creek bed slowed. It did not stop immediately. These things rarely stop immediately, but it changed in character from an advance to something more cautious, more self-protective. The sounds coming from that direction shifted. Beside her, Hutchins had gotten his own weapon functional through a clearance drill performed with the controlled focus of experience. He was firing now, adding weight to the suppression. Briggs, who had been at the far right of the line with a position less exposed to the worst of the mud flow, had maintained a functional weapon and was engaging with the measured pace that she had learned, in part, from watching Hazel work every evening for the preceding weeks. 2 weapons functional. Then Hutchins made 3. The engagement lasted 11 minutes from first shot to last. Longer engagements feel shorter in memory, and shorter ones feel longer, but this one seemed, to those present, to exist outside of time in the specific way that events of genuine consequence often do, not as a sequence of moments, but as a single extended moment with internal structure. When it ended, the rain was still falling, the mud was still moving, the darkness had not changed. The world looked exactly as it had looked at the beginning of the engagement, and the only way to know that something significant had happened was to know the difference between the sounds of before and the sounds of after. The sounds of after were rain, and the breathing of 7 people who were still alive, and somewhere in the darkness, the creek carrying its load of silt toward a lower elevation. Hutchins gave the stand-down signal at 0317. Nobody spoke on the walk back. The tactical analysis of what happened between 0245 and 0317 on that morning would take several days to compile in its official form. But the operational analysis, the understanding that propagates through a unit without paperwork, took approximately the duration of the walk back to the firebase. Every soldier present was reconstructing the engagement. Every soldier present was identifying the point at which the situation had pivoted from catastrophic to manageable. And every soldier present arrived at the same point without difficulty, the moment when one weapon fired and theirs did not. Hutchins worked through the sequence with characteristic efficiency during the walk. He had commanded the engagement. He had experienced the failure of the weapons line with the specific, sickening clarity of a man who understood exactly what it meant. He had also, at some point during the 11 minutes, noticed something he would think about for a long time afterward. Hazel had not simply been shooting. She had been managing the space, the specific placement of her shots, the selection of which targets to engage and in which order, the implicit communication that her fire provided to the soldiers beside her about where the threat was located, had functioned as a form of control over the engagement's direction. When a soldier on the line cannot fire, the most valuable asset they have is situational awareness. Hazel had clearly maintained situational awareness throughout and had used her fire to transmit information as well as to suppress. She had not needed to announce herself. She had not needed authority beyond the authority of her functioning weapon and her understanding of what the situation required. Briggs understood this differently. She understood it from the perspective of a person who had been on the line and frightened and uncertain, and who had found, in the sound of Hazel's measured fire, something to orient herself by, the rhythm of it, the control in it. She had keyed on it the way, In darkness, you key on a fixed light not because it tells you everything, but because it tells you where the center is. She had steadied her own fire by feel, by the model that Hazel's rhythm provided, and she had held the far right of the line without breaking. She thought about this on the walk back. She thought about the evenings in the barracks. She thought about the cartridges and the tray and the notebook and the way Hazel had simply handed her a cleaning rod without ceremony. The other soldiers were quieter than she had ever heard them. Tanaka walked with his rifle at his side, pointed at the mud beneath his feet. He did not say anything for the entirety of the walk back. Webb did not make a joke. Fry did not speak. Inside the fire base, they stood under the shelter of the motor pool roof and waited for circulation to return to their extremities. And nobody spoke for several minutes. Then Hutchins said, "Weapons check at 0600, full breakdown. All of you." Nobody said anything in response. There was nothing to say. The weapons inspection at 0600 was thorough, and it was quiet, and it was the most attentive the platoon had been to mechanical detail since their equipment had been issued. What it revealed was not surprising to anyone who had read the notebook, which was now the equivalent of a document that everyone in the platoon was aware of without having read. The awareness of it was enough. They knew it existed. They knew it had predicted this. They did not need to read it to understand what that meant. Hutchins conducted the inspection himself, moving down the line with a deliberateness that communicated the inspection's importance without requiring words to do so. He checked chambers, he checked actions, he checked magazine wells and feed ramps and extractors. He noted what he found. Of 14 weapons in the platoon, 11 showed mud contamination in the action, the magazine well, or both. Of those 11, 9 showed contamination sufficient to have prevented reliable functioning in conditions matching those of the previous night. 3 weapons, Hazel's, Briggs, and Hutchins' own, showed contamination levels below the threshold for functional compromise. He did not read the numbers aloud. He did not need to. He found the notebook when Hazel placed it on the table beside the inspection area without comment, open to the page she had prepared weeks earlier. The page with the clay composition data and the humidity tracking and the projected failure rates and the small line at the bottom that he had thought of as a threshold. He read it for the 3rd time. The numbers, already confirmed by what he had just inspected, landed with the precise weight they deserved. He had read it before. He had taken no mandatory action on what it told him. He sat with that. The soldiers drifted back to their bunks as the morning progressed, and the firebase returned to its ordinary rhythms, the generator, the drip from the roof, the distant sound of helicopter rotors somewhere across the floodplain. But the rhythms felt different, or rather, they felt the same, and the soldiers inside them felt different, and the difference was that a kind of certainty had been stripped away that they had not known they were relying on. The certainty that preparation was optional, that the thing they had not done would not be the thing that mattered, that the space between technically required and actually necessary was large enough to live in comfortably. It was not, as it turned out, large enough. Tanaka sat on his bunk for a long time. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had developed habits of thought that had served him adequately in conditions that had not yet tested their limits. The habit of dismissing careful people as anxious was, in most conditions, essentially harmless. It produced some unnecessary jokes and some comfortable group feeling and no visible negative outcome. Until it did. He thought about the smeared cartridge. He thought about it with a precision and honesty that was not comfortable. He had done it as a prank. He had done it to confirm a narrative about Hazel that the group had agreed on. He had done it without malice, which was a distinction that, in the current light, was losing whatever significance it had once seemed to carry. He could not undo it. He was not sure what he could do. He was not sure yet whether he was capable of the quality of action that the situation seemed to ask for. Webb and Fry were having similar reckonings at lower volume and without the additional weight of the cartridge incident. They had laughed. They had repeated jokes they hadn't originated. They had contributed to a group pressure that had made it easier to not take maintenance seriously, because taking it seriously would have meant aligning yourself with the person everyone was laughing at. Nobody said any of this aloud. It was present in the room in the way that unspoken truths are present specifically, as a quality of the silence, which was different from all the silences that had come before it. 3 days after the engagement, Tanaka found Hazel at the cleaning bench that had been set up at the edge of the barracks. She was doing what she always did. She had been doing what she always did every day since the engagement, because the engagement had not changed what she did. It had only changed what the people around her thought about what she did. He stood at the edge of her workspace for a moment. She was aware of him. She continued with the cartridge in her hand. "Morrow," he said. She looked up. He had worked out what he wanted to say and then discarded it, because what he had worked out was too neat and comprehensive, and his crime, such as it was not neat and comprehensive. It was small and specific and human, and it deserved a response in kind. "The cartridge," he said. "In the tray. That was me." She looked at him. Her expression was not angry. It was not forgiving. It was attentive, the same attention she brought to everything, which turned out to be more unsettling than anger would have been. "I know," she said. He nodded once. He could not tell whether the two words contained judgment. He suspected they were simply information. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at the cartridge in her cloth. She looked at Tanaka. "Clean your weapon," she said. "Every time. Don't miss the gas key." It was not acceptance, and it was not dismissal. It was the most practical response to an apology that he had ever received, and in the moment of receiving it, he understood something about her that he should have understood weeks earlier. She was not interested in the social dynamics of the group in the way he was. She was not performing indifference. She was genuinely, structurally oriented toward the thing itself, the work, the preparation, the rifle, the round. The people around her were real to her, but they were real in the context of the work, not separate from it. He picked up a cleaning kit and sat down at the far end of the bench. Briggs was already there. She had been there most evenings since the engagement. She did not speak much during these sessions. She had learned enough of the process by now that she moved through it without constant instruction, and Hazel offered instruction only when precision required it. Sergeant Hutchins appeared at the door of the barracks at 1800 that evening. He looked at the bench. He looked at the three of them. He leaned against the doorframe. "Morrow," he said. "As of Monday, you're the platoon's weapons maintenance lead. Unofficial designation, but it'll be documented in my notes." She looked at him. "You'll conduct the weekly inspection. You'll set the maintenance standard. I'll back whatever you say needs doing." She nodded once. That was sufficient. He started to leave, then stopped. He did not turn around. He was looking at the ground outside the door. "The brief you gave me," he said, 3 weeks ago, the one with the humidity data. "Yes, I should have made it mandatory." He walked away before she could respond. She may have had a response prepared. She may not have. It made no difference. The statement had been made, which was the only thing it needed to be. Briggs, whose hands had been still during this exchange, resumed cleaning her weapon. After a while, she said, "Why do you clean each one individually? Couldn't you just clean them all at once and be faster?" Hazel wiped a cartridge case and held it to the light. "Each one is the one that fires first," she said. "You don't know which one it'll be, so each one gets the same attention." Briggs thought about this. "That's true," she said. "Yes," said Hazel. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in 2 weeks. The floodplain was still running high, but the floodplain did what floodplains do. It receded, slowly, and the world it left behind was heavier and changed. The weeks that followed the engagement at the southern berm became, in the informal record of 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, the period when things changed in ways that were not dramatic but were complete. There was no ceremony. There was no formal acknowledgement of what had happened, beyond the after-action documentation that moved up the chain in the language of official reports and arrived somewhere above them as a notation about equipment, readiness, and adverse conditions. The individuals involved were not named in any congratulatory sense. They were soldiers who had done what soldiers do, held a position under difficult conditions. That was the official version. The unofficial version was written in behavior. The first weapons inspection that Hazel conducted as maintenance lead was attended with a quality of attention that would have been unrecognizable 3 weeks earlier. She moved down the line without hurry, checking each weapon with the same systematic process she used on her own. She spoke only to point at problems. She did not explain at length why the problem mattered. If you had been on the berm and your weapon had not fired, you understood why it mattered. 6 weapons required additional work before she cleared them. She did not announce this to the group. She told each individual soldier, quietly, specifically, what needed attention and what the standard was. The soldiers did the additional work. Hazel checked them again. 4 cleared on the second check. 2 required a third. No one complained about the standard. No one made a joke about it being excessive. The 3 seconds on the berm when no fire had come from the line had addressed the question of whether the standard was excessive more efficiently than any amount of argument could have. Tanaka became, unexpectedly, one of the more reliable members of the maintenance culture that Hazel was building. It was not penance, exactly, or perhaps it was, But penance can be a productive motivation when it's accompanied by genuine understanding of what was wrong. He was meticulous in a way he had not been before. He extended the meticulousness to the soldiers near him. He did not make it a performance. He simply did it. Briggs had moved, over the weeks of working beside Hazel, from observer to practitioner in a way that was not rapid or dramatic but was thorough. She understood the work now in a way that extended beyond following steps to understanding why each step existed. She had read, with Hazel's quiet encouragement, the technical manuals that specified the failure modes for the M4 in mud and moisture conditions. She had begun keeping her own notes, not because Hazel told her to, but because she had understood from watching what noting things down was for. Webb and Fry adapted. People do, when the evidence is thorough enough and the memory of the consequences is recent enough. They would not have described themselves as converted to a different philosophy. They would have said, if asked, that they were just doing what needed doing now that everyone understood what needed doing. This is, in fact, how most useful changes in human practice occur, not through philosophy but through the accumulated weight of experience showing that one approach produces different outcomes than another. Hutchins wrote his documentation and filed his reports and ran his platoon. He was the same sergeant he had been before fair, experienced, efficient, but there was something additional in how he received information from Hazel now. He read what she gave him the first time it was offered. He did not wait for evidence before acting on it. He did not tell her that he had changed in this way. He did not need to. She would have noticed it in the response rate, and noticing it in the response rate was sufficient. On the 41st day after the engagement, Hazel sat at the cleaning bench at the edge of the barracks. The evening light came through the gap between the barracks wall and the corrugated roof and lay across the bench at an angle that made the brass of the cartridge cases catch it and hold it for a moment. She was doing what she always did. On her left, Briggs worked through the process with the quiet focus of someone for whom the steps had become natural rather than learned. She moved through bolt carrier group, buffer, spring, magazine, without prompting, without rushing. On her right, Tanaka cleaned his rifle with the specific, thorough attention of a man who had replaced a habit he'd never examined with one he had chosen deliberately. He did not speak often at the bench. He had learned that the bench was not a social space. It was a working space. The silence at the bench was not the uncomfortable silence of estrangement, but the functional silence of people doing something that required attention. Behind them, in the barracks, Webb had his rifle broken down on his bunk and was running a cleaning rod through the barrel with an expression of moderate concentration. Fry was reseating his magazine springs. Two other soldiers were working through their own gear. The generator ran at its irregular rhythm. The corrugated roof held the last of the day's heat. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was making a joke about polishing ammunition or comparing anyone to a surgeon preparing for a grocery run or asking whether each bullet got its own individual cloth. The cartridges went into the tray one by one, clean and seated and ready. The rifle went together piece by piece in the right order. The notebook sat at the corner of the bench, closed, with its green cover looking worn at the edges in the way that notebooks look when they have been used for the purpose they were made for. Outside, the sky above the floodplain was clear. The season was turning. The days were becoming drier, and the mud at the perimeter was crusting over at the surface and firming at depth, and the floodplain was pulling its water back to wherever floodplains pull their water when they are done with it. The world was drying out. The platoon would move from Firebase Carver in 17 days. They would move to a different sector with different terrain and different conditions, and those conditions would present their own category of challenges, and the soldiers who had been through the engagement at the southern berm would arrive at those challenges having learned, in the most direct and indelible way that learning can occur, something about the relationship between what you do before and what is possible after. They would not need to be told again. Hazel picked up the final cartridge in the tray. She ran her cloth along its length in a slow circle. She checked the primer pocket. She checked the case neck. She tilted it to the light for a moment, turned it once, and set it in its place. She closed the notebook. She began reassembling the rifle. Beside her, Briggs worked in the same direction, and the sounds of their work, the small, precise, mechanical sounds of components meeting correctly, of springs seating, of catches closing, were the quietest sounds on the base, and also, in whatever accounting system applied to these things, among the most important. Outside, the flag at the perimeter marked the direction of a wind, coming off the plain, a dry wind, or nearly dry, carrying the particular smell of earth that has been thoroughly soaked and is now, slowly, giving it back. Nothing else moved.